On the German-Polish border, a mysterious team of men gather for a top-secret operation. As leaders from around the world prepare for the moment that will define their legacies and the history of their nations, reports of Polish soldiers invading Germany ring out. The truth is the first casualty of war. And here, truth doesn't stand a chance. This is the conspiracy that starts World War II, the top-secret operation that set the world on fire. These are the events that shape our world. These are the leaders that risk it all. These are the final moments before war. This is Edge of War.
Those who start wars often try to cloak their aggression with a sense of legitimacy, righteousness, or outright lies. The invasion of Poland at the start of World War II is a prime example of strategic political deception. History tells us you can't always believe what you see. You have to look deep into the actions and the leaders behind them to find the truth.
Adolf Hitler, the impassioned leader of the Nazi Party, believes the time is right for his movement to become a national force. To achieve this, he's ready and willing to use any means necessary to gain influence, power, and the destruction of all in his way. Hitler, a former soldier wounded in the Great War, a war that brought Germany defeat and humiliation, is a man with visions of rewriting history, of restoring German greatness. The Treaty of Versailles cost his country more than 10% of its territory, a loss that cuts to his core. Hitler needs to find a way for his growing Nazi party to take power. He decides on violence, brute force, and an act of deception. In the fall of 1923, Hitler perceives weakness in the German government and seizes the moment, storming into a popular beer hall where local officials are gathered.
Adolf Hitler marches in. He is accompanied by armed guards. He makes a very dramatic entry into the room and finally captures the attention of the crowd. It's very dramatic and very chaotic.
Revolution! He's here!
He declares that the national government in Berlin is dissolving. He says that the army is on his side. All of this is made up. It's all bluster, but at the time, Hitler thinks it's going to be true.
To legitimize his coup, Hitler hauls 3 Bavarian government officials aside. At gunpoint, he pressures them to join his cause. Hitler tells them he has 4 bullets, 3 for them and 1 for himself, should they refuse.
He really believes in the triumph of the will. He believes that if you have the willpower, that you can make history change.
The men agree, but it's all a bluff. And once Hitler releases them, they turn on him and call in government forces. By morning, the Nazi Party's coup dissolves in a hail of gunfire on the Munich streets. Wounded, Hitler briefly avoids capture by hiding at the home of a Nazi sympathizer.
Hitler had failed. He didn't like to fail. It made him feel weak. That was not part of his persona.
The failed coup does do something for the brazen young Hitler. It makes him a household name as a champion of German pride, fame he looks to exploit. While in prison for treason, he writes his manifesto, Mein Kampf, spelling out his vision of Germany's destiny. A year later, he is released and ready to rebuild the Nazi Party.
Hitler is someone who really is, at some level, an actor. He's someone who practices his gestures in front of the mirror. He practices his poses in front of the mirror. But once he sort of gets into the role that he's into, it's really him. It's no longer an act.
Now focused on winning elections, he takes his particular brand of deceit and ruthlessness directly to the German masses.
All through the election campaigns, Hitler and the Nazis are basically creating unrest in the streets. They're creating street disturbances. They are causing lots of trouble. However, all along, Hitler is saying he actually wants to create or bring back order to Germany. So in a sense, what the Nazis are doing is they're creating disorder so that they can later claim to be Germany's saviors.
Denn dieser Tag, das landvolle Feiertag der Wiederauferstehung des deutschen Volkes aus ewiger Zerrissenheit, Zersplitterung und gegenseitigem Kampf.
Hitler played upon the emotions of a dispirited German population, epitomizing the idea that he alone could regain German greatness. His ability as a speaker was such that even his most violent critics realized his ability to mesmerize a crowd with his rhetoric.
His promises to the German people and his strong-arm tactics pay off. The Nazi Party wins over 30% of the vote, and Hitler is appointed chancellor. A taste of power, but not enough for a man planning to rewrite history. A month later, a mysterious fire damages the German parliament building. Hitler claims the blaze is part of a communist plot to take over the country. He turns the crisis to his political advantage, suspending civil liberties and throwing his enemies behind bars. Many believe Hitler and the Nazis are behind the fire. If true, it's a cunning act of deception and sabotage, a false flag operation, impersonating the very enemy you want to attack, a tactic Hitler now knows works. In the aftermath, Hitler takes complete dictatorial control. Swelling the army fivefold, he orders thousands of new tanks, armored vehicles, and planes be built.
The investment in the military created jobs, rebuilt a lot of infrastructure. It restored German people's faith in the government. On the back of that, a lot of the foreign policy gains that they were able to make, flexing that military muscle, gave the people faith in Hitler.
In public, Hitler speaks of restoring German pride in the right of a superior people to rule over the masses. Hitler also speaks of Lebensraum, or living space for Germany to grow. Behind closed doors, his military commanders learn the true danger and vicious intent of these words. His ambitions go far beyond land Germany lost in the war. He wants all of Eastern Europe. And he is impatient to the point of risking the start of another world war. On March 12, 1938, Hitler marches his troops into Austria, a former ally, without firing a shot. With the world watching, he now turns his gaze further east, demanding that the Sudetenland area of Czechoslovakia, once a part of Germany, be returned.
Hitler's view towards the Sudetenland was simple. The population there was German, and he was going to collect all Germans under the rule of Berlin. The Czechs had acquired the territory unfairly, and now he was going to put things right.
Hitler goes further, threatening to simply march his army into the area on his own timetable. His aggressive approach, almost an ultimatum, rattles world leaders. One of those leaders is British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. Well known as a practical, honest, and trustworthy politician, he's in many ways the polar opposite of Adolf Hitler. While Chamberlain is sympathetic to German claims, he sees Hitler's saber-rattling as dangerous. England suffered terrible losses defeating Germany in World War I, and Chamberlain dreads the thought of another war.
Chamberlain believed that the world's problems could be resolved through the application of common sense and reason and through one-on-one negotiation. He assumed the good faith of other statesmen.
In September of 1938, armies across the region are on high alert. Chamberlain decides to act as an envoy for the rest of Europe and try to defuse the situation, or at the very least, buy Europe some time. Taking the very first plane ride of his life, he arrives in Germany and meets Hitler face to face.
For Chamberlain, this is a huge moment. He believes that he is now going to accomplish peace in his time. He thinks that he's going to negotiate with Hitler. He believes that Hitler is reasonable and that if he gives Hitler everything he wants, that Hitler will then stop making demands and he will have achieved his goal of peace.
Neville Chamberlain was willing to redraw Germany's borders in accordance with the principle of the self-determination of peoples, so that those borders incorporated Germans currently living outside the Reich.
However, Adolf Hitler must be patient rather than risk causing a war. Sensing he'll now get what he wants, Hitler agrees to wait, promising that the Sudetenland is his only ambition. Having read and marked up Mein Kampf, Chamberlain decides to look past evidence that this is an outright lie.
At the end of the first meeting, Chamberlain writes to his sister and he tells his sister, "I've looked Hitler in the eyes and I believe I can trust this man."
With armies still mobilized across Europe, Hitler and Chamberlain meet 2 more times, hoping to work out a deal. The high stakes are noted across the ocean, too. U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, pressing for a peaceful solution, writes Hitler directly with his concerns. On September 29, 1938, a final conference is held in Munich. The parties agree to allow the Sudetenland to be transferred from Czechoslovakia to Germany. War is averted. Through the threat of war and deception, Hitler gets what he wants. Believing diplomacy has worked, Chamberlain approaches Hitler to secure what he hopes will be binding peace.
Chamberlain asks Hitler if he can meet Hitler later that evening in his apartment. Hitler says fine. Chamberlain goes, and when he's at Hitler's apartment, he whips out a piece of paper that says that Germany and England will never fight each other again.
Chamberlain asked Hitler to sign this document. Hitler agreed, but it meant very different things to the 2 statesmen involved.
Chamberlain goes home, he waves this piece of paper, he's very proud of it, he believes he's accomplished what he set out to do, he thinks he's achieved peace in his time, and it's something that's very popular.
Hitler left the meeting. His foreign minister Ribbentrop came up to him and expressed concern that he might have committed himself to something. Hitler's response was, "That piece of paper is of no further significance whatsoever."
Having tested their nerve, Hitler feels his adversaries are weak and afraid of war. Swallowing up Eastern Europe might be even easier than he thought. But the other leaders in Europe are making their own plans. They are not fools when it comes to the gamesmanship that precedes war, even if it involves lies, shadowy figures, and a secret operation inside Germany itself.
There have always been men who have the daring, nerve, and gall to try to affect the course of history through bluff and deception. When European leaders allow Hitler to take the Sudetenland, Hitler's convinced that by leveraging the threat of war, he's well on his way to becoming one of the most powerful leaders the world has ever known. And for a brief while, he succeeds. However, he's also extremely naive. Leaders like Chamberlain and Roosevelt couldn't sell another war to their countries. But Hitler's relentless territorial ambition does it for them. If Hitler were able to control his ego and urge for power, he might dominate Eastern Europe for decades. Instead, his aggressive actions cross the line, waking the sleeping giants and forcing them to take action. The lesson here is that bold threats may sometimes intimidate. They may sometimes win concessions. But if you overuse the threat of war, sooner or later you'll be at war, and it may not be the war you want. On the international stage, proper statecraft has to proceed from an understanding of a country's national interests and its leaders' deeper ambitions. It's a classic amateur move to put too much faith in personal relationships or in the superficial friendliness of someone you're negotiating with. Do this, and you risk being deceived. In their face-to-face meetings, both Chamberlain and Hitler make assumptions about one another. Both are wrong. History reveals the truth.
By October 1938, Germany under Adolf Hitler is growing. Through bluff, deception, and the threat of war, Europe hands him the Sudetenland. It's a stepping stone to his true dream of a greater Germany. Hitler feels European leaders are spineless, and if they caved once, they'll cave again. 5 months later, tossing aside the Munich Agreement, Hitler orders his army to keep on marching eastwards. Meeting little resistance, he quickly swallows up the rest of Czechoslovakia. The move stuns the world. In England, a shocked Chamberlain is left betrayed.
In March of 1939, by seizing the rest of Czechoslovakia, Hitler made it obvious that he had designs in the rest of the continent, not just that area populated by Germans.
As the rest of Europe braces for war, Hitler turns his gaze squarely toward his next target: Poland. Restored as an independent state in 1918, Poland is led by Edward Śmigły-Rydz.
Śmigły-Rydz was a highly competent soldier who rose rapidly through the ranks of the Polish army. He won a number of signal victories and was regarded not only as a brave man, but a highly competent soldier.
Polish independence for Śmigły-Rydz is absolutely crucial. It's what his work was all about, it's what his life was all about, it's what his dreams were all about.
The leader of an army 1 million soldiers strong, he recognizes the impending threat of war.
Hitler's coming to power meant that Poland found itself trapped between hammer and anvil, the Germans in the west and the Russians in the east. This created a certain paranoia in Polish foreign policy as it found itself isolated and threatened.
While Hitler's ambition is to wipe Poland off the map, he publicly focuses on a more reasonable goal: territory Germany lost at the end of World War I. He demands that Poland return the city of Danzig. Śmigły-Rydz, painfully aware of what just happened to Czechoslovakia, flat out rejects Hitler's request.
Danzig had a number of important features for Poland. First of all, it had been historically connected to Poland. Secondly, it was economically vital for Poland. And third, it symbolized Poland's ability to stand up to Germany and its demands on Polish territory. Should the Poles have surrendered Danzig to the Germans, it would indicate that Poland is incapable of standing up to German demands against Polish sovereignty.
Śmigły-Rydz gets vital allies. In the House of Commons, Chamberlain states that Britain will support Poland if it is attacked. The French also guarantee their allegiance.
At this point, Chamberlain realizes that Hitler and the Nazis can no longer be trusted. So when Chamberlain gives the guarantee to Poland, Hitler is very, very angry. He didn't think that the British would ever stand up to him. He just didn't think that they would do that. That was not part of his vision of what the British were all about.
Hitler pounded the table angrily and stated, "I will brew them a devil's potion."
British rearmament, at first a precaution, is now a preparation for war. Pouring half of the government's revenues into the armed forces, Chamberlain orders a military buildup, including the Spitfire, Hurricane fighter planes, and a radar net surrounding Great Britain. Other leaders in Europe and the United States are also growing their armies in response to the Nazi threat. Knowing his adversaries are preparing for war, Hitler acts quickly. He tells his commanders to get ready for an invasion of Poland within the year. Now facing his first real opposition on the international stage, Hitler feels he needs a concrete reason to attack.
Hitler is of the belief that potentially France and Britain may waver as the guarantors of Polish independence if an incident might be created which would give them a way out.
Deception has worked for Hitler before, and it could work again. He turns to Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, two leaders of the SS, the Nazi Party's loyal paramilitary. Heydrich has two nicknames, the Hangman and the Blonde Beast. As head of an SS branch called the SD, the Nazi intelligence service, He keeps an index card system on all potential persons of interest in Germany.
Its job is to chase political enemies, both internally and externally, to collect information on people of interest to the Nazis. Hitler apparently had a file. It's Heydrich's job to collect information on everybody.
Information can be lethal. In June 1934, Heydrich was a key planner in a purge known as the Night of the Long Knives, where dozens of Nazi Party enemies are executed. Now Heydrich is building another small elite team, led by a man he can trust. That man is Alfred Naujax.
Alfred Naujax is a fairly shadowy figure. He is someone who worked directly for Heydrich, and he really specialized in dirty tricks.
Heydrich has Naujax hide out at a secret location and wait for further instructions. The plan is dubbed Operation Himmler. Naujax's own code word is Großmutter gestorben, grandmother died. Heydrich's plan requires him to recruit an additional, larger group of soldiers.
Heydrich determined that they needed about 250 men for the operation. Orders were sent out to SS offices to recruit men who had knowledge of Polish language and customs. Suitable candidates received their orders to report for specialized training. They had no idea what they were preparing for.
For the average SS man receiving the telegram, the stakes are soon obvious. He must hand over all personal effects identifying him as a German and sign an oath of secrecy.
Potentially, they know the seriousness of the operation, they know the ruthlessness of Heydrich and of Himmler, they know the Gestapo methods, that wives, children can be arrested. They know that if they betray or speak about the operation, there could be consequences for their family.
By 1938, after 5 years in power, Hitler's worn out his welcome on the international stage. Reports of his harsh treatment of the Jewish population in Germany only isolate him further. Yet despite world opinion turning against him, Hitler seems determined to fulfill his ambitions at any cost. And full control of Czechoslovakia gives him deeper resources, armaments, technology, industrial production that makes him even more powerful. His army keeps growing, an army he shows off to neighboring countries in massive public rallies. His aim is intimidation abroad and building support at home. But creating offensive military capabilities is the kind of behavior that touches off arms races and sets a countdown to war. In 1939, Polish leader Gleiwitz is painfully aware of German leader Adolf Hitler's massive military buildup. His country is at great risk, and the pressing question is, who will act first? Leaders in these situations look for any advantage they can get. They know a well-executed preemptive action conducted before a war could save many divisions on the battlefield. We could call it a force multiplier, a marginal cost now, risking a few hundred of your men in order to change the course of a war, potentially even secure victory.
By the summer of 1939, both sides of the border are preparing for war. As part of his million-man army, Gleiwitz has 25,000 horse-mounted soldiers, the largest standing cavalry in the world, and a revolutionary weapon he hopes can slow down a German advance. Tested under top-secret conditions, the WZ-35 anti-tank rifle, a precursor to the modern bazooka, can pierce the thick armor of German tanks. Yet Gleiwitz grows nervous. He knows his own country's weaknesses all too well. Poland has only 180 tanks to Germany's 2,600. Polish aircraft number less than 500. The Germans have 5 times that amount.
Gleiwitz was between a rock and a hard place. He just didn't have the money to make the Polish forces anything like comparable to the German forces, so he faced dilemma after dilemma.
Another dilemma is strategy. Gleiwitz's best defensive positions lie behind rivers well back from the border. But that leaves his country's western industrial areas vulnerable. He feels he has no choice but to line up the bulk of his soldiers on the exposed frontier.
The morale of the Polish army was probably second to none, especially when defending Polish national territory.
I think the Polish soldiers would have been committed to their cause and believed that it was crucial for their sense of self, crucial to act right by Poland.
Despite this, without support from his French and British allies, Gleiwitz's army will fall to the Germans. Now numbering 1.5 million strong, the soldiers rally to Hitler's speeches and swear their allegiance to the Nazi cause.
Es ist der glanzvolle Tag der Aufrichtung einer neuen großen Volksgemeinschaft. Über alle Gebiete hinweg, die Streiter, die Stadt und Land zusammenfasst, vor allem stehen lässt, reiches Wehr und Waffen.
Although Hitler tells the world that his troop movements are only training exercises, his impressive military might is primed to strike. Like in the past, Hitler talks peace, but has built his army for war.
Hitler has a very aggressive timetable. He's something of a hypochondriac. He believes that he's going to die soon. The other reason is that Germany's been rearming now for a number of years, and the British and French have not yet caught up, and Hitler wants to take advantage of that situation.
Hitler tells his inner circle that a full-scale invasion of Poland will take place on August 26th, an attack that will be justified. He's setting the stage for an intense assault deep into Poland. The German Third Army in the north, as well as Army Group South, will storm towards Warsaw, while the Fourth Army will pierce the Polish corridor. A powerful concentration of fast-moving forces designed to penetrate deep behind enemy lines. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The goal? To destroy Poland and wipe it from the map.
Hitler asked his military leaders to wage a war of annihilation against the Poles. He stated that they would kill without mercy every man, woman, and child of Polish descent or language.
The German people are also primed with a propaganda campaign that demonizes the enemy to the east.
Many of these stories would have been exaggerated or puffed up, even if there was an element of truth to them. But their net effect was that German soldiers had a very negative view of Poles.
Including 200 SS recruits being held at a secluded training facility. Transported undercover and sworn to secrecy, they're unaware of the details of their upcoming mission.
Over 100 men were issued Polish uniforms and old carbines, along with 30 rounds of ammunition. They were also given Polish Army-styled crew cuts, as well as specialized training in Polish procedures.
Others are issued German police uniforms and receive their own specific training.
The remaining men, they were given typical Polish clothing, jackets, caps, cigarettes, money. In the evenings, they were instructed to remain in character, so they would sit around and speak in Polish. They would sing Polish songs. Being completely isolated, they had no idea about their mission, so they all began to believe that their mission was as a suicide squad.
Undercover SS officer Alfred Naujux recruits a radio operator and an announcer who speaks Polish to bring with him to Gleiwitz, a small town near the Polish border.
Naujux and his men went to Gleiwitz, where they holed up in 2 hotels, posing as geologists and engineers. There, they awaited their orders, never knowing when they would come.
Reinhard Heydrich, the leader of the Nazi Secret Service, decides he still needs more men. But unlike the recruits, he now wants men who are disposable. Men who won't be missed.
Gestapo officers go to a concentration camp near Berlin. They select about a dozen prisoners, political prisoners, career criminals. They then handcuff these prisoners and transport them and take them to cells near the target area.
Plainclothes Gestapo also nabbed 43-year-old Franz Honiak. An unmarried salesman, Honiak is known throughout the region as a vocal Polish nationalist. Honiak and the other prisoners are referred to by the sinister code word Konserven, canned goods. Like the recruits, they have no idea of the fate that awaits them.
England and France say they'll stand up for Poland if Hitler attacks. However, undeterred by these promises, Hitler continues to ready his army and plans the top-secret Operation Himmler. In fact, he tells an international diplomat that if the Poles cause the slightest provocation, he will shatter them without warning. And in so many pieces, there will be nothing left to pick up. Hearing this, Poland is warned to tread carefully. Poland must now rely on British and French promises and hope that those promises will be sufficient to deter German aggression. But when Poland relies on the British and French deterrent, it compromises its own ability to defend itself. Poland is actually left in a worse position than if there had been no promises at all. Alliances between nations can serve as a credible deterrent to war. However, if you can't count on your allies, your treaty is worth less than the paper it's written on. If a nation agrees to protect another nation, it has to demonstrate its preparedness, its capabilities, plus the will to act on that promise. Otherwise, potential adversaries may perceive weakness and move to take advantage.
August 22, 1939. Due to Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's growing fear that diplomacy has failed him, he decides to send a letter to Hitler, pledging again that the Allies won't abandon Poland, as they did Czechoslovakia. The last-minute show of solidarity infuriates Hitler and causes him to delay his invasion plans. This is not good news for Reinhard Heydrich's secret team in Gleiwitz.
The fact that Naujocks and his men were waiting in their hotel room for 2 weeks, I imagine the thought of what could possibly go wrong, staging a firefight within Germany against a German station, especially the radio station, where the staff were unaware of what was happening, would have been extremely testing to their nerves. Their mission to justify war was just a phone call away.
And Naujoc's phone rings. He answers, only to hear the words, "Call back." When he calls back, the voice on the line is Heydrich, with only 2 words, "Grandmother died." The operation begins.
While Naujoc's team packs up, German units protecting the border move out of the area, allowing the SS to quietly replace the regular guard at the Gleiwitz radio station. Now it's time to bring in the canned goods. Franz Honiak, arrested by the Gestapo the previous day, receives a visitor in his cell.
An SS member dressed like a doctor injects Honiak with a sedative. He's led to a car which will then drive him to the station.
Naujocks and his men make their way to the radio station. The men emerge dressed as Polish civilians, carrying machine pistols and revolvers. Naujocks orders 2 men to wait outside for the canned goods.
Shortly after 8 p.m., the rest of the men rush the building.
The 5 insurgents burst into the building. When the men enter the station, they're encountered by the night watchman. They tackle the man and drag him off downstairs. They also find 2 other employees of the station, the only 2 other people who are there that night, and they tie them up likewise downstairs.
Once in control of the radio station, the German SS team is ready to make their fake announcement. The false flag operation Hitler wants as reason to launch his invasion. But there's a problem. The team is unable to work the equipment or find a microphone.
One of the staff members who's tied up downstairs is brought up and beaten with the butt of a gun. He refuses to tell them how to operate the equipment. The other 2 staff also claim that they don't know how to operate the equipment.
Finally, in a storage closet, they find an emergency microphone used for local storm warnings.
The member of Nyack's team, who was assigned to deliver the Polish language message, began his announcement. Attention, this is Gleiwitz. The radio station is in Polish hands. Then Nyack and his men begin firing shots into the ceiling and making all kinds of noise to give the impression of a big fight underway.
The theatrical invasion of Germany is heard on radios throughout the area. Outside, another car arrives, delivering a semi-conscious Pontiac. Left behind, he becomes the Nazis' first victim of the invasion of Poland. Proof of Polish aggression against Germany.
Naljoks is the last to leave the building. The whole operation had taken less than 15 minutes.
The other SS recruits of Operation Himmler, dressed in their various outfits, are driven to their own staging areas along the border.
There are a number of SS generals and colonels taking part in this operation. These are very senior officers taking part in what is a sabotage operation.
At an isolated customs house in Hochlinden, Germany, SS recruits dressed as German border police assume defensive positions north of the building, while other SS recruits dressed in Polish army uniforms move in from the south.
The insurgents at Hochlinden began firing into the nighttime air, cursing, screaming, creating a chaotic scene. The men playing frontier police returned their fire, likewise into the nighttime air. There's no fire exchanged between the 2 groups, but there is a lot of noise. The insurgents now storm the customs house, destroying everything inside, smashing whatever they can with their rifle butts.
The rest of the canned goods, the German political prisoners and career criminals, are dressed in Polish army uniforms, given sedatives, and delivered to the customs house where they meet a grisly end, left behind to look like proof of a Polish attack.
What is amazing is these Germans attacking Germans. As far as we know, there wasn't a single Pole involved in any of these attacks.
65 other SS men dressed as Polish civilians ransack a forestry house on the border further north, chanting and singing in Polish before disappearing into the woods.
The local police have very little time to carry out an investigation themselves. Within an hour, the SS arrive and secure the scene. The SS will carry out an investigation on a crime carried out by the SS.
News of the Gleiwitz broadcast and the 2 other attacks along the border spread quickly through Germany and is eventually picked up by the international press.
These false provocations were used by the Germans to suggest that the Poles had aggressive intentions towards Germany or actually violating German territory.
Smigly-Ritz knows his troops didn't attack Germany. It has to be another act of deception from Hitler. Under pressure from Britain and France, he's risked the security of his nation by going out of his way not to provoke the German dictator.
The Polish army was mobilized on August 30th, then under international pressure forced to demobilize, and then it had to remobilize again. The result was chaos and troops going back and forth from and to the front. Put the Poles at an enormous disadvantage because probably only half the Polish army was ready for combat when the Germans invaded.
Hitler has his excuse to attack. his excuse to invade Poland. As dawn breaks, the sound of war is in the air. It is time for the rest of the world to act.
Hitler takes a lot of risks during his rise to power and in his early years as a German chancellor, including the failed coup at the beer hall, possibly the fire at the Parliament building, and in many of his interactions with international leaders. But there's no question, invading Poland is his biggest gamble to date. On the eve of his invasion, with the world stacked against him, watching his every move, Hitler tells his commanders, "Our enemies are little worms. I saw them at Munich. Now I have Poland just where I want it." For Hitler, there's no turning back. He's ready to take the world on in war. 1.5 million men leave their barracks. They're ready to fight for the Nazi German cause. For years, Hitler has stoked the fears and passions of the German people, creating a smoldering rage and an angry self-righteousness, waiting only for a trigger to act. Hitler's a master of propaganda. War is sudden, shocking, startling, often completely illegitimate, but it's usually, at the very least, cloaked in some language of legitimacy. This is often a strategy intended to win support at home and among the troops, as much as to influence the enemy of the outside world. Hitler claimed he was acting in self-defense, reacting to Polish provocations, the biggest of which he himself had staged. News of an alleged Polish attack is printed in papers around the world. Hitler hopes it will neutralize Poland's allies. It's a classic example of strategic deception designed to gain national support and international legitimacy. Regardless, it helped Hitler convince his own soldiers of the rightness of their cause. And righteousness is a very powerful tool for anyone waging war.
September 1st, the Polish town of Wieluń is heavily bombed. More than 1,200 civilians are killed in an act of terror designed to demoralize the Polish population.
The Germans deployed massive force against the Poles. They brought in 1.5 million soldiers from 4 different staging areas. They also used the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, to level cities that were in no way strategically important.
Right from the beginning, military operations were directed against Polish civilians. There were over 500 villages torched, over 16,000 military executions.
Hitler claims that he is acting in self-defense.
What's striking when the German soldiers get to Poland is how quickly they engage in brutal actions against Poles and Jews, and so it seems like the Nazi propaganda was very effective.
In England, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain knows the German dictator all too well. He sees Hitler's false flag operation at Gleiwitz as just that, a fabrication, a dirty trick to justify a war.
Chamberlain makes a speech in which he declares that the blame for this war rests with one individual, Adolf Hitler.
To Poland, it doesn't matter. Facing Hitler's overwhelming force and brutality, Gleiwitz and his undermanned and ill-equipped Polish troops are forced to retreat on many fronts.
Gleiwitz, although a competent commander, quickly lost control of the battle. Polish communications were poor, and as a result of that, Gleiwitz quickly was isolated from what was going on at the front. The retreats of the Polish army quickly descended into routes because the Polish units were unable to be in contact with one another.
By September 8th, just 1 week after the start of the invasion, German forces reached the outskirts of Warsaw, the Polish capital.
There were a number of important points of resistance in the September campaign. The most famous is Wisna, where 600 or 700 Poles stood up against 42,000 Germans for 3 days. All the Poles died, and the last soldier of Poland blew himself up with a grenade.
With losses mounting, Gleiwitz is still counting on British and French help. Help that is not coming.
France promised to invade Germany within 15 days of the outbreak of war. Britain promised to respond to the bombing of Polish cities by bombing German ones. Neither was in a position to carry out its guarantees. They were serious about their commitment to Poland, but they recognized that Polish salvation would depend upon Allied victory in the broader conflict.
As Polish resistance collapsed, Gleiwitz was in a desperate psychological position.
Facing Germany alone, Gleiwitz gets more devastating news. The Soviet army attacks Poland from the east. With his country being carved up by two large armies, Gleiwitz retreats across the border into Romania as Warsaw falls.
Hitler made a speech in Danzig. He stated that Poland would never rise again in the form of the Treaty of Versailles, that this was guaranteed both by Germany and by the Soviet Union.
In exile, Gleiwitz helps organize the Polish underground and soon sneaks back to Warsaw to fight for the country he loves. Shortly after his return, he dies of a heart attack at the age of 55.
Gleiwitz is a controversial, indeed tragic figure in Polish history. Even those who were most critical of him regarded him as a brave soldier. He found himself beyond his capacities in attempting to run the entire war.
By late 1939, an independent Poland is just a memory, a casualty of Hitler's ruthless ambition for Lebensraum and a greater Germany, and the world is engulfed in war.
Hitler got the war he wanted, brutal and vicious. By late 1939, the invasion of Poland was over and a world war was just getting started. Nobody knew how or when it would end. Looking back, as the world stood on the edge of war, it was clear that Hitler was willing to deceive and murder innocent civilians and even his own people to achieve his goals, a fact world leaders refused to admit until it was much too late. Hitler's methods, including his use of false flag operations, delivered him the support from his countrymen while holding his enemies at bay. Against evil, appeasement never works. This lesson carried over into Western negotiations in Korea, Vietnam, and even today in how we deal with terrorists, a lesson we paid a high price for and must never forget.